Super. Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Thanks for joining. For those who don't know me, I'm David Plum, and my role here is to help facilitate these meetings. Before we get going, your chair, Secretary Klauser, is here. Why don't I turn it over to you, Secretary Klauser? I'm happy to share the agenda and walk through if you want me to do that. And we also have at least one new council member with us today. So just, we could do a quick shout out to that. But let me, Secretary Klauser, let me turn it over to you just for some opening words, anything you want to say.
Sure. Thanks, David. Welcome, everyone. Why don't we start with our new members? I see Peter. I don't see Eric. So we'll start with Peter Sterling. He's representing the renewable energy seat, and I think this is his first meeting. So we wanted to say hello. Peter, you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. My name is Peter Sterling, and I am so excited to become part of the Climate Council. I've been the executive director at Renewable Energy Vermont, the trade association representing the renewable energy sector, since August of 2021. Prior to that, for 4 years, I was the chief of staff in the Vermont Senate when the Global Warming Solutions Act was written. So it's nice to be on the council after working hard to get the bill passed into law. So excited to work with everyone on this to move forward in fighting climate change.
Welcome aboard. We're happy to have you. And our other new member to this meeting is Eric Foran. I still don't see him, but I'm not sure everyone's on my screen. Okay, so Eric's serving as the acting director for Vermont Emergency Management, and he's joining us in that capacity. We also I just wanted to direct everyone's attention to email you likely received Thursday or Friday.
I'm doing all of it.
Sorry.
Where Sue Minter resigned her seat. So that will be, now we have 2 vacancies on the council, just directing folks' attention to that. And then David, did you want to walk us through the agenda? Or you want me to?
I'm happy to do it. Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Great.
It's
Thank
easier.
you.
Okay. Great. All right, folks. So we're having a somewhat shorter meeting than usual, although it's still going to be a 2.5-hour meeting. And let me go ahead and share my screen. As is usual, you'll see in the chat a link to the materials and this agenda. So feel free to pull it up on your own screen if that's more comfortable for you. But we'll have our usual business here of approving minutes. And then if we should have Phoebes, I see Phoebes, great. So as is our habit to have a just transition reflection in the beginning, we have Phoebes Potter here from ANR's newish environmental justice office, and Phoebes is the environmental justice coordinator. And so Phoebes can give us an update of what's going on there and how that office is thinking about its work and how that intersects with the work of the Council on Climate Action as well. So that we have Phoebes to walk us through that. Then we've got the piece of business that should only take a little bit of time, which is you as a council confirming the steering committee composition. There's even been some evolution of that since the steering committee met last week. We'll walk through that. But that's a formal moment for you as a council to approve membership in your steering committee. Then there's a piece of that we've just put 10-15 minutes on that Secretary Moore wanted to make sure the council's aware of what's going on with an effort around life cycle analysis and rulemaking. And so Secretary Moore will do that. Again, that's short. And it obviously if there's questions, but we're not looking to make any decisions there. It's more of an update from ANR and Secretary Moore. Speaking of updates, it's an update about how the steering committee and counselors have made a pathway forward to address the concerns that were raised around the biomass recommendations that you looked at in your last meeting. So we'll talk about that process and how that's going to work, and when you all as a full council and others should be able to see something that comes out of that process. And then there's two more things that are more like updates. One is a legislative summary that was asked for. It's just a review of things that are tied to the initial climate action plan. Again, these things are still a work in progress in the legislature this year because you're not done at the state legislature yet, but this is a quick update about where things stand right now as they relate to priorities in the initial climate action plan. And then the final pieces we're going to do is the Climate Action Office and Jane are going to provide an overview of all the work that's happening and how it relates to the priorities that you all have expressed as a council and what's in the climate action plan, et cetera, and what you've talked about for your priorities going forward. So there's that. We'll do public comment just past 1 o'clock and have some final reflections based on that comment and then adjourn. So there's a fair amount of sort of information being provided today, and obviously an opportunity to ask questions about it. There's one real decision-making moment, which is ensuring that you decide on the composition of your steering committee going forward. So let me pause and say any questions, concerns about the agenda before we dive into it. All good? Okay. Great. All right, so let me drop this, but we'll be reviewing and approving these minutes right now. So as you can see, these are clickable here. If anybody needs to, just take a moment and click back into those if you haven't looked at them yet. I'll give folks a moment if anybody needs a moment to do that. And then if there's any concerns about the minutes, now's a good time. David, go ahead. You're on mute there.
Yes, my last name is spelled wrong.
Oh, well, that's no good. We will
Agreed.
fix that.
It's D-E-E-N. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Apologies. Paula?
Yeah, I just noticed that at the top it says March 13th and then the actual date time says April 24th.
Oh, there's some typographical things that got in there.
Yeah, I don't
Thank
see
you,
anything else though.
everybody.
Thanks.
Yikes. Okay, thank you. Anything else, folks?
David, I just noticed a minor spelling thing that I just sent to you rather than take time with it, but
Thank you. I see it now in the chat. Yep. Okay, thanks. Okay. Any concerns about the notes that haven't already been voiced? Anything else? Any concerns about treating them as approved, assuming these typos are corrected?
Nope.
Okay, great. Let's consider those to be approved. Thanks so much. All right, so the first thing we want to do is Phoebes, if you are ready, let me turn it over to you. And Phoebes, if you can explain a little bit your role as environmental justice coordinator and where you're at and what you think would be helpful for the council to understand about the work that you all are embarking on in the office there.
Great. Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. And my understanding is that it's practice that you all kick off with the just transition reflection. So that was sort of the context within which this invitation was made. So yeah, I'm Phoebes Potter. I am one of actually two environmental justice coordinators. My counterpart's name is Alex Lintner, that were hired under Act 154, which so anyone who hasn't taken some time with the legislation I just dropped in the chat for you, you're welcome to do that at your leisure. But so Act 154 that was enacted in 2022 is the state environmental justice law, and it creates a pretty ambitious framework for state government to orient itself to be more accountable to equitable outcomes around environmental issues defined very, very broadly, from, sort of everything from pollutants and our natural resource and environment to what does our personal environment of home look like. So all the way to housing, transportation, all these different intersecting issues that make up for each of us what our personal environments in the state of Vermont feel like. To me, in some ways, what this law, the corollary to what you all are doing, I think the Just Transition Subcommittee, was set up to try to think about how to proactively center equity in the rollout of the Global Warming Solutions Act. In some ways, the Act 154, the state environmental justice law, does the same thing, has the same charge. How do we proactively center equity as the outcome that is driving all of our environmental related policymaking across the state? And there are 10 state agencies that are specifically sort of covered under the law. Just for some context, I'll just talk really high level because we could get in the weeds so easily, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but just the high level connections between this work and what you all are doing. I'm based at the Agency of Natural Resources in the Secretary's office. So, work literally right next door to the Climate Action Office. So, it's been really great to be able to build relationships with the Climate Action Office team and to be able to talk about all these different intersecting sort of work that we're doing together. The Act establishes an environmental justice interagency committee and an environmental justice advisory council. So the interagency committee is made up of representatives from the 10 covered state agency, plus the Office of Racial Equity. And then the advisory council is really set up to have representatives from different directly impacted sort of frontline environmental justice communities or interests of those communities. We have, for example, somebody who's specifically identified to represent, what's considered environmental justice focused population, which means being from a census block that has a high concentration of either poverty levels of Black, Indigenous, and people of color living in those census block regions, and or Vermonters living there who speak languages other than English as their first language or primary language, so may have language access barriers. So those are the three main categories that the environmental justice laws sort of use to define who we're talking about. And I know that the Just Transition principles that y'all subcommittee put together kind of gives an even broader sort of way of thinking about directly in frontline communities. And so the advisory council, has folks that represent folks that would identify with those demographic markers, but we also have somebody who represents, food insecurity and concerns around that. So there's also those sort of topical representatives. And both of those bodies are charged by law in section 6006 of Act 154 with considering and incorporating the Just Transition principles as written by your subcommittee in the implementation of our bill. So it's legally connected, our work. This isn't just a theoretical exercise. Always carrying around the principles with us. And I think the two really big areas that are relevant, of course, is how we do public engagement and how we bring the public and communities into starting to think about how do we better incorporate equity into our work. And then, I know that the self-assessment questionnaire that was put together by the Just Transition Subcommittee talks a lot about the need to look at environmental burdens and benefits and ask ourselves, is there an equitable distribution of who's benefiting as we transition and deal with climate change, and who's dealing with the burdens of that transition, and are we making sure that that is equitable across the state of Vermont. So these two bodies that we have charged with doing this work hand in hand are first met back in March. It was March 10th. And, that was really just let's get to know each other, let's orient to the work at hand and what we need to achieve together. And then we, unfortunately, but with some silver linings, needed to slow the work down a little bit. There was some technical issues around being able to authorize per diem payments for advisory council members. That's all being resolved. It did mean we took a longer delay than planned. So the second joint meeting of the advisory council and the interagency committee is scheduled officially July 18th from 12 to 4 p.m. If you want to mark it down in your calendars. It's a public meeting. We really would love to have as many people who are interested in this work be there as possible. It will be hybrid, virtual, and in person. And we'll be sure to follow up through Jane in her office and share you all the details when we have it for that meeting. And during that meeting, we're going to really be anchoring into the question of how do we meaningfully engage environmental justice focused populations into how we're even thinking about implementing this law, from, again, assessment all the way through implementation, and having these stop points all the way through of getting their voices heard. And the key deliverables that we want the public informing us about are every covered agency is charged with creating a community engagement plan. And I know a lot of agencies have different varying community engagement plans in the works already. So obviously we'll sync up to what exists and doesn't exist and try to level set and within the 2 years that we have to do this, hopefully have state agencies feeling like they really have a strong sort of framework for equitable and meaningful participation by the public, but also better coordination across agencies. So that's a big bucket of the work. Like I said, being accountable to environmental benefits, where are we spending money that has environmental benefits and who is receiving those benefits. We need to design an environmental justice map that sort of shows the layers of environmental burdens on communities at the census block level, and then use that map to inform rulemaking at the agency level, to start to incorporate the factors of equity and the distribution of burdens in different rulemaking decisions across agencies. And then we need to also have every agency start to report every year on any civil rights, so Title VI sort of violations that are reported, and also environmental justice issues. So basically making sure all agencies get to the point where there is a robust system for civil rights complaints to be filed, and a process in place for those concerns to be addressed. So agencies actually have to take those reports and funnel them through the advisory council, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, to get feedback on how to respond to those. So again, creating more, to me, again, a law that really creates accountability systems for state agencies, and really expansively about how we do policy work. So I'm going to stop there. Very high level, like I said. I am very happy to be available to folks to reach out to me. I'll drop my email in the chat if you have questions. We're all just getting oriented to the meaning of this work right now. We're just starting to craft the different deliverables that are expected of us. And we'll just continue to work really closely with the Climate Action Office to make sure we find those efficiencies and points of intersection in our work, to make sure that we're just taking advantage of the fact that there's so many people coming together to grapple with these important issues right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Phoebes. That's really, really helpful overview. And we have just a moment here, 5 minutes or so, if folks have questions for Phoebes, how this is going to be rolled out and how we may see this in the council work. So I open it up if folks have any questions for Phoebes or quick feedback. Any
I
reaction?
don't have any feedback. I just wanted to compliment Phoebes on the presentation. That's a lot that's been bitten off, and some of this work can be amorphous at times because it is genuinely a new way of thinking, or better said, it's a new commitment to undertaking the transformation that's been long overdue, Phoebes. So thank you so much for the work you're putting into it. And we certainly here at the department look forward to working with you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And seeing more in the chat from Joetta Miller. Okay. Any other questions? Doubts about what's going to happen? All right. Super. Great. I see more in the chat as well. Oh, yeah. Joey, go ahead, please.
Sorry, thanks. I don't want to cut this conversation short if people do have questions or thoughts. Phoebes, that was super helpful. Look forward to working with you. Thanks for the good work. this is tangential, so I just wanted to maybe placeholder, but it feels a little bit related. I just have a little question related to sort of process it for filling open positions on the council, or more so maybe if we have thoughts, and maybe this is at a different time, feels like we don't have time today, but Sue Minter's resignation letter made a very specific request for BIPOC representation, which seems important. And I just would be curious if there's a process underway to fill that, if it relates to what Phoebes was just describing, or is there a role for us? It feels a little squishy, and I know people have a lot on their plates, but it was a very specific and I think important request to follow up on. Thank you.
Joy, I think it's in the spirit of what we're talking about, even though it may not be directly related to the responsibility of Phoebes and the other folks in that office. I see that Secretary Moore put your hand
Yes,
up.
that's why I
Perhaps
describe
wanna-
it as tangential.
Yeah. But I think it's in the spirit of
placeholder.
this. Yeah, I would say if folks want to talk about that quickly, we have a little bit of time right now, and I don't have a problem with that. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, it just would reflect the process for appointments, which is the appointments to refill Sue's seat will come from the legislature, and would encourage legislative appointees to reach out to those who appointed them and make clear that request. I know we've talked about this a considerable amount, and certainly the administration has reflected back to legislative leadership the strong desire of the council to have more diverse representation. But I think that's a message that really is going to be reliant on individual counselors to carry forward as well.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. Kelly?
Yes, that's exactly what I would suggest. And I wanted to add that I believe Sue is also making efforts to try to help bring forward a candidate to the legislature that would fit the requirements of her seat, but also be a member of the BIPOC community. So that's another thing that I think we can be doing as we transition off. We can help try to find replacements, but ultimately it is the legislature that has to make those decisions.
Thanks, Kelly. Jared?
Yeah, and just to build on that more specifically, since Sue's seat was appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees, if folks do have candidates to nominate or recommend, they would be applying to that Senate Committee on Committees, which is currently composed of Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman, Senate President Phil Baruth, and Senator Dick Maza. I believe that in the past, the nominations have gone directly to the Senate President and to the Lieutenant Governor.
Okay. All right. Super. Anything else either related to what Phoebes laid out or these other issues, which are definitely of similar nature? Okay. And so what I'm hearing as well is like each of you, particularly those who are appointed, what you can do individually in addition to what has been transmitted from the full council by ANR. Each of you can play a role in transmitting the desire for more diversity on this body. Okay. All right. So thank you, Phoebes. Appreciate that. You're welcome to stick around, and you're also welcome to go back to doing the other work you have to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I will have to step off, but really grateful for the time, everyone, for your work.
Thanks, Phoebes. Take care. All right. So the next thing we wanted to do is around steering committee composition. In here, there's a document that's attached to your agenda. You can click through it. And if someone wants to drop that link one more time in the chat, maybe Marion or Jane, if you don't mind just dropping the link of the overall agenda, or specifically the steering committee composition link. So I'm going to do just a tiny bit of background here so folks can understand what's going on here. Particularly if you're new to the council, one of its first things it did way back I barely remember which year, 2021, early 2021 is when the council first did a process document. And there was a suggestion to create a steering committee of 6 counselors, 2 from administration, 2 from folks who were appointed by the House, and 2 from folks who were appointed by the Senate. And the idea of this steering committee was to help make sure that the agenda planning and the guidance for the full council has a place to happen where counselors are present. So it doesn't rely on just the facilitators or A&R staff to do that work, that there's a role for counselors in making sure that the overall process of the council is moving forward in a way that feels appropriate for counselors. So that was created back in 2021, and you all voted for steering committee representatives, and that's been relatively unchanged for the last couple of years. One of the steering committee members stepped down off the council, Chris Campany, and that left a vacancy in the steering committee. And this also prompted a moment of, well, let's do a pause and an opportunity for others to raise their hand and say, I'd like to do this, or folks who wanted to step back. And so that pause happened. As you'll remember, in the last council meeting, we encouraged people to write in. I sent around a little form, or Jane did, one of the 2 of us, and folks did raise their hands, and some current members said they'd be happy to step off. And the document you have attached to your agenda is the result of that process of people raising their hands and other people being willing to step aside. I'll note that the 2 members from the administration, who are Secretary Moore and Secretary Clauser, will continue on the steering committee, and they expect to continue being part of the steering committee. And then we have Senate appointees and House appointees. And as it happens, there's 2 people who have raised their hand to fill the 2 slots from the Senate appointees. Jared, who has been a participant in the steering committee and is willing to continue that role, and Kelly Klein, who is willing to step into that role as Lauren Oates steps down from that role. So from the Senate, there's 2 spots, and 2 folks who have raised their hand are willing to do it. On the House side, and we'll come back to about how we're actually make this decision, but on the House side, we had that empty seat from where Chris Campany stepped off the council. And then Liz Miller had said she'd be willing to step aside and let someone new come in. And if there wasn't somebody new coming in, Liz would also be willing to keep going. And on here, Bram raised his hand and said, I'm willing to do this. And Paula Melton raised her hand and said, I'm also willing to do it. And when Paula did that, it was before we had talked with her and sorted out her subcommittee roles. And so you'll see on the version of the document right now, a little asterisk next to Paula's name, and I'll let Paula explain that a little bit in a sec. But when we finally had a chance to sit with Paula and say, what priorities, how would you want to invest your time? It turns out that investing time in 2 subcommittees, and Paula, I don't want to speak for you, so I would appreciate actually if you say it for yourself, but investing time in 2 subcommittees feels like a better option for you than a steering committee role and 1 subcommittee role. So let me just do a quick pause, and Paula, just make sure I'm getting that right, and we've got this framed up correctly right now.
Yes, that is exactly right. I talked to Jane this morning, and we settled on the 2 subcommittees, which I think is a better aligned with my abilities right now as a new member and what I can contribute. So thanks
Super.
for asking.
Excellent. And so in that scenario, Liz, who had said, I'm okay continuing, and I believe, Liz, we checked in with you, and that's indeed the case still this morning is still the case. And so what would end up happening here is, instead of Paula's name here, it would be Liz Miller's name as the second House appointee to continue on in the steering committee as Liz has done to date. So, and I'm looking this on my screen. I'm not sharing my screen right now, but just so everybody knows what I'm looking at this document right here. And I hope others, if you're not looking at it, let me just show you. So this is the document. It describes here the 6 members of the administration. Secretary Julie Moore and Kristen Klauser are the 2 there. The Senate appointees, the 2 folks who've raised their hand for those 2 slots are Kelly and Jared. And the House appointees, the 2 folks who raised their, well, really the 3 folks who raised their hand, Bram and Paula, and Liz being willing to continue on if there wasn't someone who wanted to do that. And so Liz would now be here and Paula would Adam Baker, I'm getting a little feedback from your line. If you could mute yourself, that'd be great. Thanks. So it's kind of an interesting decision for you all because there's not a whole lot to decide in the sense of unless there's something else that folks, counselors want to bring up right now to help shape this, or somebody who actually does want to raise their hand right now, a little bit late, but happy to entertain that. And just to be real clear that what we would be asking you all to approve today is a list that includes Kelly, Jared, Bram, and Liz. The way we had talked about it before is the Senate appointees would select their 2 folks and the House appointees would select their 2 folks. Since there's not a whole lot of decision making, we can probably streamline that, but that would be the process for us to do right now. Jared?
Thanks, David. I just wanted to offer a little bit more context about what I think the role of the steering committee has been, and certainly what my personal opinion of it is, and that is primarily as a body to be in service of the council. And I see that in 3 ways. One is the body that is dedicated to meeting people. I mean, I think it's important to note that all steering committee meetings are open for all members of the council to attend and contribute to. But it's, those 6 folks that are committing to show up to help work on preparing agendas, draft agendas for the between the council meetings with other councilors and steering committee members and our facilitators at CBI. And also, I think we've always seen the steering committee not as a decision-making body, but as a body to help do work between council meetings to help prepare material to inform council deliberations and decisions to make sure that they're better teed up. But I just want to make sure that everybody's kind of aware that we don't see this as a decision, and historically has not been a decision-making body, but one that helps prepare agendas and material for full council meetings for deliberation and decision-making. And then also playing a role trying to facilitate connections between different subcommittees of the council. So I just wanted to offer some of that context about how the steering committee has functioned, some of its primary roles, certainly what I personally view as the role of it as we go into this decision, and hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Jared. That is. Okay. So before we do any sort of formal approval, I just want to open up a space. Any questions, any doubts about what's happening or why things should happen in a certain way? Any questions or reactions people have? Rich?
I think this is fine. And unless there's, unless people want to have separate votes on the House members and the Senate members, I would just recommend that we approve this slate of 4 people by consensus. And I note that we've got both, half the people we're talking about will provide some continuity on the steering committee and half are new to the steering committee. And I think that's good. So it's a pretty good combination, and I accept Jared's explanation of what the steering committee does. And I think this group of 4 people would serve us well.
Thanks, Rich. Any other reactions or thoughts, David?
Is there any question of having the full portfolio of the role in the steering committee if we don't follow procedure, which is to have House members put their stamp of approval on the two House members and the Senate the same? I mean, once you get into the political realm, things like that can suddenly be important.
Could you say that question one more time? Or are you worried about the way we make the decision right
The
now?
procedure requires that the House members select their representatives, right? And that the Senate members select their representatives to the steering committee. Is that correct?
Our process document that we laid out, I believe, yes, has that.
And my question is, how important would that be if the question of legitimacy of representation became a political question? The way to avoid it becoming a political question is just follow the rules.
Okay. Yep.
But
Okay. Yep. Well, we certainly can do that. Yep. There's a hand in the conference room.
I just want to clarify that.
Can you speak up just a little bit more, Jane?
Yes, I just want to clarify that we checked the process roadmap as we were discussing this right now, and it does not, it says that the legislative members would vote on the legislative reps, but it does not speak to House voting on House and Senate voting on Senate.
Okay.
okay, I misunderstood that.
Yeah. And my apologies for not knowing that off the top of my head too. I should have known. Thanks, Jane, for clarifying. That's really helpful. June?
I appreciate the suggestion Rich made about consensus-based acceptance of the slate, but I agree with David that we should follow that process.
Great. Okay. So any other reactions or comments before we make a decision here? Okay. So the way I'm going to suggest doing that, given what we just spoke about, is I'm going to speak specifically to all members of the council who are appointed by the legislature. So not the administration folks, but whether you're appointed by the House or the Senate. And I'm going to ask specifically, do any of the appointed members of the council have any concerns about accepting the slate of 4 candidates we just discussed, Jared, Kelly, Bram, and Liz, to be the representatives on the steering committee from the appointed members? Are there any concerns from appointed members of the council to that? Okay. So seeing no concerns from the appointed members of the council, we'll treat that as a slate of folks approved by you to represent you on the steering committee. Okay, great. Jared?
Thanks, David. I just, sorry, I didn't bring this up sooner. I do think it would be helpful for us to clarify the length of that term. I think that implicit in this is that, you know, once there are a new set of terms, like this came up when the House appointments were either made or folks were reappointed. So I don't know, it probably makes sense for this to be of the same term until those appointments expire or need to, and if there are vacancies in the meantime, of course, that can be filled. But either way, I think we should just, for sake of clarity, establish what that term of those 4 subcommittee members is. I think that an obvious option is until the next House appointments come up, which would be, you know, to serve over the next 2.5 years, is my understanding. Because I think that the House appointments were initially made for 2 years, and now it has gone to a 3-year appointment.
Jared, could I make a suggestion there? And I'll jump to the hand in the conference room from Jane. But my suggestion is one of the tasks over the next couple of months is to update the process document. And I think it's a little bit challenging for us to do this in real time right now to make a term. But when we update that process document, let's make that a key point in that document that that the term is much clearer on the steering committee. So you're agreeing to have folks be your representatives now. When you agree on a process document in the coming months, you'll agree to what the length of that term, and we can do it there. That would be my suggestion, if that seems agreeable to everybody.
I think that's a good suggestion, David.
Okay, great. And Kelly puts in the chat, just want to make sure we have a quorum of legislatively appointed people here today. So I wish I was quicker on my feet with this kind of stuff. So what would that mean? So that of all the legislative appointees, of which there's a certain number, I don't have it on the top of my head, that at least 50% are here?
Yes, so I think we have a couple of vacancies and I think I also get 9, but including, or were there 10?
Can you say that again, Jane, sorry?
Jared just put it in the chat, so it's good. I would
Oh,
follow it.
so out of 15, there's 13 because 2 aren't filled, and we've got 9 in the room. Okay, thanks.
I was pretty sure we
for
were
making
good,
sure.
but wanted that on the record before we moved forward. Thanks.
I really appreciate that, and I thank everyone for being attentive to those details and helping me make sure we're not missing details that we'd regret later. So I appreciate all the feedback on that, making sure we do that right. Okay, so with that, I'll say we did it, and thank you. And a special thank you to those who are willing to, who raised their hand and said they're willing to do this, because it is work along with the work of being on the subcommittee. So I appreciate everybody willing to step up and play this role. Okay, so with that, assuming we're all good with that, and let's go ahead and move on to the next pieces on our agenda. The next thing up is Secretary Moore. I'm just looking on the screen. Is Julie here?
Yep. See
Okay,
if I
there you
pop
are.
to the
Sorry,
top
sorry,
if I
sorry.
start talking.
Excellent. So we had you teed up here, Secretary Moore, to talk about life cycle analysis and rulemaking notification. And we had just talked about 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes on that. So I'll turn it over to you for that update.
Sure. So I don't even know that I'll need that long, David, but just wanted to make sure counselors were aware. I had sent out an email a few weeks ago now. I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat, though, indicating that we received a written request from Pike Porter at the end of April, asking us to adopt rules to codify a life cycle analysis procedure. And so we have agreed or committed to do that work. And we'll, at the same time, we also have ongoing, as I hope folks will recall, a life cycle analysis contract with the Eastern Research Group, ERG, that is doing some important work focused on the energy sector, but has key deliverables that are due within the next month or so. So our plan is to take advantage of that work that's already underway, have those deliverables serve as a basis for this conversation, but move forward with that rulemaking. We've roughed out a schedule internally that would have us filing with ICAR, which is sort of the first step, formal step in the rulemaking process before the end of the calendar year. But wanted to flag this request for the council as well as answer questions. And I think Rachel Stevens, oh, I see Rachel, who is one of the ANR attorneys, is on and sort of our point person on that rulemaking process and available to answer questions if folks have them. And I will drop the ERG a link to the ERG study in the chat now too, or the scope, excuse me, a link to the scope of work for the ERG contract into the chat too.
Great. Okay, so that's an update from ANR in response to the letter that was received. Any questions for Secretary Moore about that, or for Rachel Stevens, who's here, who'll be leading up some of the rulemaking effort. Any questions there? Rich?
Thanks for the report. What about time frame?
In terms of specifically,
In terms of what you expect, how quickly will the rulemaking proceed? How soon will you be getting significant input from ERG, et cetera?
so ERG has a set of deliverables right now. The contract has those deliverables all being submitted to the agency by the end of this month. So we should, assuming they remain on schedule, we should have benefit of that material. We then anticipate a stakeholder process. Sometimes I would refer to this as some pre-rulemaking stakeholder engagement, recognizing the conversations and are at times easier to have, and we have more flexibility to have them when we're not engaged in formal rulemaking. Anticipating a lot of that stakeholder engagement will take place later this summer and into the early fall, again, with the goal of filing with ICAR before the end of the calendar year.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Did you say ICAR or LCAR?
Said ICAR. Did I mess that up, Rachel?
No, you're right. No, that's the interagency committee on
Okay,
administrative.
so then the process actually goes on beyond that.
Correct.
Yep.
That's the first step in the formal rulemaking process. So there would be another opportunity for public comment once the draft rules are accepted by ICAR, but feel like, particularly given some of the technical complexity of what's involved here, doing this pre-rulemaking stakeholder engagement will have real benefit.
And we have a document that we can read and understand and et cetera. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Super. Anything else there? Questions? All right. Thank you. Okay. The next thing on our agenda is following up from our conversation last meeting, where we discussed the biomass recommendations coming out of that biomass task group. In that, you all as a council did not approve the recommendations as they were written, and you expressed a variety of thoughts on them, on those recommendations, both encouragement around aspects of them and concerns around other aspects of them. Subsequently, we opened a space for counselors to provide additional written input of their reactions to those recommendations, and several of you did that. The steering committee reviewed that, came up with a plan for dealing with that, and we wanted to just update folks on what that plan is and what to expect in the coming months around that activity, and when you as a council might expect to see some results out of that activity. So I'll say a few things. There are several of you counselors who are involved in this small group that's been put together to try to find a pathway forward. I'll say in just sort of the overarching piece, as I understand it, is that what was put together is a group of counselors that try to pull from the subcommittees that originally were the components of the biomass task group, and have a counselor, ideally one from each. And those group of counselors can try to do two things. One, make sure there's an efficient way for all of you, the full council, and them as a smaller group to benefit from all of the information that was discussed and presented at the biomass task group. There's a large number of presentations that you heard about. And so trying to make sure there is a clean way to tap into those presentations, see them easily, look at the minutes from those task group meetings, watch recordings, and know what areas to watch for certain things. So there's a commitment to make a sort of interactive bibliography of everything that happened on that. And CDI is going to help to create that, working with that small group. And the next thing to do is to figure out how to synthesize and understand the comments that came in from all the counselors and what that might mean to put a new version of those recommendations back up to you as a council that tries to incorporate those comments and concerns, and also make sure that everybody feels like they've had a chance to really understand what happened in that biomass task group and all the incredible amount of information that was pulled together and collated by them. So that's my understanding what's happening. There is a small group that's going to be doing that work over the next couple of months. And their hope is to come back at your next council meeting, at least with some draft ideas of what it looks like, to get that back in front of you and something that you as a council could potentially approve. So I'm going to just invite other folks who are being part of that group and who have been willing to step in and help out. Bram's there, Kelly's there, others, Secretary Moore is there, and some others. And so I'll just invite anybody else who wants to supplement what I said about the pathway forward. Bram?
There are electricians and plumbers here making a lot of noise, which causes my dogs to get hysterical and make even more noise. So I apologize if I become inaudible at some point soon here. I think our sense is that there was a great deal of good science and good data and good thinking in the biomass task group. And there was a process that led to a set of related recommendations that, as written, the majority of the council was not comfortable accepting, and that there's a bit more work to be done. And we did hear from, I think, 8 people provided feedback about their specific concerns. It wasn't quite posed. Actually, it may have been, the question may have been posed as, what would it take for this to become something you could support? And I think that the smaller group has lots to work with, both in terms of the original material and in terms of the feedback. And we'll try to go down the shortest path possible to incorporating the feedback and crafting something that feels like it will be what's best for our achieving the goals set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and what will make most sense to the whole of the council in light of the other work we're doing.
Thanks, Bram. Other reflections of those who've volunteered to be part of this? Kelly?
Thanks. Yeah, one of the things that I walked away from our last council meeting with was just a feeling that I didn't have enough information. And that's where we want to bring a lot of that amazing data that the biomass task group benefited from into some sort of digestible format. Because if I feel that way, I thought others may also want the ability to reflect more on some of that really good data. And then also just taking the information we had. This little small group is basically just a drafting group, just trying to compile things, get them into a format that can provide that extra information that some of us may want, and then bring that to the full council with plenty of opportunity for discussion in public meetings before this moves forward again. So just sort of the group is just doing a little bit of drafting, but then there's a lot more opportunity for public engagement and public comment after that.
Thanks, Kelly. Liz, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to follow up on that comment, knowing that the group is going to do drafting and review material that the prior task force had taken a look at. I offered to answer any questions that might come up as they go along, but not actually sit on or participate in the drafting per se, having gone through the task group process. I'm sure that there are others who are on the task group who would likewise also be happy to answer any questions along the way. So I just wanted folks to know that I certainly will be a resource for that group if they need it, having sat through that process. And I'm sure others who did so also would be willing to serve in that same sounding board or question answering sort of way.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay. Any questions from other counselors about how this is going to go forward? Any advice for this small group as it tries to do this? Joey?
Well, just starting with the appreciation for the work that the task group did and proactive appreciation for the volunteers who are going to coalesce the good content and put together a suggested, draft. I think that's great. Will there be any sort of summary in writing of this process, the people who are in the drafting, and then the sort of timeline? That'd be helpful. Obviously, this is a very important issue, and I very much appreciate that the task group, after a lot of work put in, wants to get to outcomes, like how are we actually going to grapple with this and our roles to make recommendations. So it would be helpful to me, as others are very interested, to have that in writing, that we can understand where those moments of opportunity lie. And then this, in the theme of being tangential, this may not be the role of the task group the small group, work group, whatever it is, but obviously biomass related to the work underway with the sort of operationalizing and examining how it might fit into a clean heat standard. There's other things that are connected to this, and I don't want to weigh this process down, but I do think it's important for us to be thinking about those moments of opportunity, because this biomass will fit into, and already does fit into some of our existing regulatory frameworks. So if there are recommendations about how those processes benefit from the work of the task group and our recommendations, I just want a placeholder that may be something we want to think about down the road.
Okay. Thanks, Joey. And I want to clarify your first point around the summary, like a summary of the process. Are you thinking more backward looking of what happened in the task group, like that sort of bibliography thing? You think more forward looking, what's going on right now and how it gets
like who is the work group? What are they doing? What's the timeline? Is this going to be a climate council? What's the climate council meeting coming up? Just the sort of stuff that came out of your mouth, David, earlier.
Write it down. Yes.
Yes, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
You got it. Yep. Thanks for that. David, go ahead, please.
I understand what Joey's asking for, but at this point in time, if you offer an estimated time frame, I think people should understand that it's estimated, that because this is a large, cumbersome, complex, weighty discussion, we may say, all right, and we did in the meeting, that we wanted to have something ready for the September council meeting. Well, we may not make it, and I'm not sure that I want someone beating anyone about the head and the ears, because it takes longer than it takes sometimes.
Okay. Right. Recognize it's challenging. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other questions about how this is happening? All right. Super. All right. So that brings us to the next piece, which is a quick update again from Secretary Moore on the legislative actions that are most relevant for initial climate action. And just, I will say, absolutely, we're doing public comment in towards the end of the meeting. And if you have comments around what we just talked about, we absolutely want to hear them. So please do that. Please stick around for that because we want to hear input. I was just looking at Annette's comment in the chat. So this next piece is Secretary Moore talking about the legislative summary. There's a little chart that's linked into your agenda.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share it on my screen too, David.
Perfect. Even better.
Oops. Let's see. I am not sharing the right screen. Hold on. I don't think. Could folks see that?
We saw a memo to Carla.
Yeah. All right.
Do you want me to
But-
share? I have it up, so I'm happy to if it's your screen.
Yeah, now I'm not clear why that was what came up. All right.
How's that? Is that what you want to share?
That is what I wanted to share. Thank you. So this is what we identified as the 5 key pieces of legislation that were taken up this year by the General Assembly with significant ties back to the initial climate action plan, as well as the status of each. I'm not sure any of them need a lot of explanation, but would be happy to provide some if it would be helpful to folks. 2 of the two outstanding bills at this point, H126, which is the 30 by 30 conservation bill, as well as the transportation bill that includes a number of adjustments to sort of transportation programs that are consistent with recommendations of the climate plan, are both currently on the governor's desk with an expectation that he will take action on both before midnight tonight. But happy to answer questions, would probably defer on S112 to Commissioner Tierney and H479 to Michelle Boomhauer.
Great. So this is an opportunity just to make sure everyone's aware of what's happening. It's not necessarily the opportunity to debate the merits per se, but certainly if people have questions about how all this work ties in to the initial climate action plan or the priorities you've set out for yourselves in the coming year or two, it's an opportunity to reflect on that, particularly folks who have been less involved in the legislative process. Any questions about what's happening here and how it ties back into some of your priorities? Rich?
I guess I would be interested in hearing a few words from those familiar with these bills, at least the ones that have been signed, the degree to which they are linked directly or indirectly to the recommendations of the climate action plan. Even general comments would be helpful.
So sorry, Julie, go ahead.
I was going to take S100, but happy to. All right. So S100 has a number of provisions related to, which I would say is related to densification and smart growth, including creating multifamily housing units and incentives for infill development in designated centers. And so felt that there's some significant alignment there between the recognitions in the climate action plan of the need for sort of concentrated development and the way that that it is being promoted through this housing bill by providing modest regulatory relief for housing projects taking place in sort of existing designated centers. And I don't know if there's somebody from ACCD on who could get into more detail than that, but that's a 30,000-foot view of that particular piece of legislation. I see Bronwyn's on. I don't know if she'd like to add to that.
Hi, all. I'm here. I mean, I thought was I think a pretty good, I don't remember which unit of metric you're using there, but it's a pretty good high level view. Just to say that I think we're working on a couple of studies to help sort of prove out the metrics here, but we just sort of generally know that when folks are living in more connected places where they're closer to the places that they need to get every day. It reduces VMT. It opens up some opportunities for them to get around in ways that don't require, a single occupancy vehicle. I think, it's a lot harder to quantify, and we're not going to see immediate benefits necessarily. But when we're thinking about those 2050 targets and what needs to happen to make those targets a little bit easier to achieve, a little bit less costly to achieve, it's a pretty important strategy.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I don't know if June, you want to jump in and talk at all about S112, and then we can turn it over to Michelle for H479.
No, sure, of course.
I
If
can't
you-
hear.
Oh,
I'm sorry, who is that who can't
no,
hear?
it's just David. He had a little problem with his mic. Go ahead.
Okay,
June. Sorry.
very good. So S112 is a product of many different folks working on this. From the department's perspective, it originated with the comprehensive energy plan that was issued in 2022. And what we were undertaking at that time was a comprehensive review of renewable energy legislation and how it perhaps needs to be rationalized and updated to reflect the good work that's been done in the last 10 years in the state and beyond. So that's a comprehensive look at anything from modeling analysis that's done to come out with baseline assumptions in studies or in drafting standards, to looking at more comprehensive reform of regulatory constructs such as net metering and the like. In the session itself, there was a considerable amount of discussion about this toward the end in the Senate, I believe, that resulted in a legislative study, not a legislative study group, but a larger stakeholder group that's going to get together to examine this area for updating in general. And I would expect that recommendations that we've made here in the Climate Council will be informed by the wisdom that emerges from that study group, which, if I recall correctly, includes stakeholders such as legislative representatives, to ensure that there are certain types of analysis, including REMI modeling analysis, that is done in the service of this work as well. And if you'll forgive me, that's about all that that I'm prepared to say about this today.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I'll jump in with the transportation overview. The transportation bill H479 is probably going to be signed today or tomorrow, is my guess. Starting at the top, there's a $7.6 million allocation of funding to continue the electric vehicle supply equipment, leading to the installation of more fast charging along designated fuel corridors. And we also continue to have the monies that are in Bronwyn's program from 2021, which are moving EVSE deployment at the multi-unit dwelling, workplace, and public venue and attraction levels. We worked to codify all of the incentive programs, the new PEV, the Mileage Smart, and the Replace Your Ride programs in statute, because there had been sort of a number of years now of modifications to these programs that were in session law. So it was difficult to follow the trajectory of what had occurred in those programs. So that has been accomplished. While there were no additional monies included for the incentive programs, we still have, significant resources. This is sort of last check in the past few weeks, 8.2 million for the new electric vehicle program, 2.3 million for Mileage Smart, and 3.2 million for Replace Your Ride. We also created a new Electrify Your Fleet program to provide incentives to
municipalities and business entities across Vermont who maintain fleets to help them transition. It's a $500,000 initial amount of funding. And there is an extra sort of incentive within that carved out for the nonprofit sector for their transportation fleets. The e-bike incentive program received an additional $500,000 in the Budget Adjustment Act and then $50,000 in the transportation bill budget. And we made some modifications to the e-bike incentive program to target those incentives to lower income households who would more than likely use the e-bikes for a trip reduction in lieu of a vehicle trip. The mileage-based user fee legislative intent language was advanced. So we are now authorized to build a program to commence the collection of a mileage-based user fee from all battery electric vehicles registered in Vermont starting on July 1st, 2025. That's the time frame where we expect more than 15% of the new pleasure car registrations in the state are going to be plug-in electric vehicles. So that's consistent with the climate action plan. Also included authorization to subject plug-in hybrid electric vehicle pleasure car vehicles to an increased annual or by a biennial registration fee starting also on July 1st, 2025. Since the plug-in electric vehicles will not be subject to the mileage-based user fee. We will also continue to work toward a fee for kilowatt hours that are dispensed through certain electric vehicle supply equipment available to the public, so as to continue work towards supplementing lost gas tax revenues from plug-in electric vehicles. The mileage-based user fee, of course, is only going to be applied to vehicles registered in Vermont. So we're going to need a separate system to address public charging. We were authorized to commence, not commence collecting the fee until the fee structure is codified in statute. It's expected that that work will occur in 2024. And we were authorized state match funds of $350,000 to apply for a $3.5 million federal funding opportunity to actually do the systems development that will lead us to being able to collect a mileage-based user fee. There in the budget, there were $12.8 million in investments of projects to support the implementation of the carbon reduction plan when that's published, and also the Protect Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is also under development. We're to come back to the General Assembly next year with a report on the outcomes of the carbon reduction plan, the Protect Hazardous Mitigation Plan, and the equity framework effort, and to provide suggestions on how all three of those plans and their associated policies might be integrated into the state's transportation policy statutes. We did a fairly comprehensive update of the complete streets statutes to consolidate the information in one place in statute, to update the definitions, adding a training program that the agency will provide for municipalities and other entities who were engaged with complete streets, and also to develop a searchable public data source for easy review of what projects are occurring each year. There was language to reiterate the mandate to update the Vermont state standards. The agency's undertaking this under the title of the Multimodal Highway Guidance Update, which will encompass extensive stakeholder engagement. And this is as a follow-on to the engagement we undertook in 2015 when we were working towards initially developing efforts to upgrade the standards with Smart Growth America. And the outcome will be a more comprehensive resource, which will have like a searchable online portal with resources of the guidance, more context sensitive examples, a training component, and also a lot of outreach for the consulting communities, and others who will be working with these standards or this guidance. The Bicycle, Pedestrian, and Transportation Alternatives Program, which funds many of the bike ped efforts, was funded at 18.2 million, and it will implement 55 construction projects and the design of an additional 37 projects across 77 Vermont communities. The public transit funding was at a historic high of 48.8 million. And investments there will include the continued zero fare public transit for rural local transit routes, and 5.2 million for electric buses to continue to electrify the fleet, which is currently includes 27 electric vehicles in operation or on order, with a plan to apply for federal funding to acquire 17 more. So the 5.25 million would be the match for those 17 additional buses. And finally, the rail program is going to implement $43 million in rail projects, including 8.85 million for our support of the Ethan Allen and Vermonter passenger rail service. And that includes the supporting the recent addition of the New York City to Burlington passenger rail service extension. That's it.
That's all? No, it's just, okay. A very complete thing. And I was like tempted to interrupt, and then you kept saying things that were very relevant to climate. And I was like, well, it's still relevant, So thanks, Michelle, for that.
David, do you want me to do 126 too? Just because I realized I skipped over it initially, but can give a very high level quick summary, which is this bill would direct A&R in partnership with VHCB, as well as a broad group of stakeholder conservation organizations in Vermont and the Land Access Opportunity Board to look at and develop a plan that would put Vermont on a track to achieve conservation of 30% of the landscape by 2030 and 50% of the landscape by 2050. And the first piece of that is really an inventory of what has already been conserved in Vermont. I think that information, or I know that information is out there, but it's counted in a bunch of different ways. We believe we're somewhere in the vicinity of 26 to 28% conserved right now. So kind of a two-step process, but one that would ultimately be consistent with President Biden's America the Beautiful strategy, as well as a recommendation of the climate plan.
Okay. All right. Well, Rich, you kicked off a pretty detailed set of comments. So thanks for your question.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for the answers and all the work that went into the legislation that you just described.
Super. Okay. Anything else before we jump into the next thing today? All right. Let me stop sharing. All right. So the next piece that we wanted to do, and again, this is in the spirit of sort of sharing helpful information. And Jane has prepared a few slides to give you all an overview of what the Climate Action Office is up to, because it turns out we really haven't had a conversation at the council level about the work of the Climate Action Office since it's really gotten going. And so we thought it'd be helpful to provide this information because it has so many direct connections into your priorities and the initial climate action plan. So Jane, let me turn it over to you. I see you already got your screen going, so that's great.
Well, let me check first. We're trying out a new volume, new speaker approach. Do I sound okay?
Better. It's better.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. If at any time I sound muffled or you're not hearing me clearly, I can see you, David, clearly on the screen. So just give me
I'll
a
make
thumbs
some
down.
signals. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for allowing some space and time today for this update. As David mentioned, we have been sharing with you bits and pieces of information as we work to stand up the Climate Action Office within the Secretary's Office of A&R, but haven't done a comprehensive look at the administrative and programmatic functions of the office. We see this update as something that we'd like to do for you all periodically and shift more to focus on the implementation work that the office is driving. But for today, I'm going to try to balance the presentation a little bit about the core functions of the office, the staffing, and some of the questions that might come up around that and how we're framing up the work. And then I'll pivot to highlight some of the key areas that we've been working on over the last year and see as priorities in the coming months. I'll try to keep it short and then have plenty of time to have questions with you all and interface with staff sitting around the table too. So a recommendation within the Climate Action Plan was to stand up a Climate Action Office. Within the Climate Action Plan, it didn't direct where that office would sit and left discretion really for the administration to think about that. And climate action itself and climate programmatic work does not sit neatly with any one agency of state government, but there was an appreciation and recognition that the way the Global Warming Solutions Act was set up, that there were core responsibilities that sat squarely within the Agency of Natural Resources, namely the statutory requirements around reducing emissions and some of the other work that we'll highlight around measuring and tracking progress and the relationship with all of you that we support through compliance with open meeting law and the contracted services with CBI and others. So as we looked to make the case in the fiscal year 24 budget, which is the budget that we're operating within right now, we made the case that that office would sit within the Secretary's Office of A&R, but support a broader vision for climate action across state government. So that means for us that we're working closely with our divisions and programmatic work within our own Agency of Natural Resources, but also working across state government to understand the cumulative actions that state government are taking to help meet the requirements and goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. As we've thought about staff and thought about the work core to our office, we've been thinking about providing significant expertise and capacity around programmatic work related to mitigation, resilience, and adaptation, both in the natural and working land and built environment. But we've also been thinking about what ties us all together in telling a compelling story about how we monitor and track progress over time. Understanding that, as I said, the work doesn't live solely within A&R, and we really only cover a very small piece of what all of government is doing. In putting together a proposal for the Climate Action Office, in addition to thinking about the positions that we needed within A&R, we also made the case to set up an interagency advisory board. This actually isn't really dissimilar now from how the EJ work is functioning. There's a EJ advisory committee and then an interagency board for environmental justice as well, thinking about the state responsibilities. And we sort of have a mirror relationship happening with the climate work now too, with the Climate Council and then an interagency advisory board that was stood up that represents all of the agencies really related and having ties back to the Climate Action Plan. So the Public Service Department sits on it, Transportation, A&R, Vermont Emergency Management, the Ag Agency, Buildings and General Services, the Agency of Human Services, both the Department of Children and Families, as well as the Vermont Department of Health, ACCD, the Agency of Commerce Community Development, and then also appreciating Leslie Ann's unique role as the state climatologist, and with that, the distinction of actually being the Vermont State Climate Office. We are uniquely called the Vermont State Climate Action Office. Leslie Ann, we're thinking about a long-term relationship with how our two offices work together and how we tie the roles and responsibilities unique to Leslie Ann through and marry that to state government. So Leslie Ann has also been participating on the Interagency Advisory Board. One of the early phases of pulling that group together was to think about what the objectives of that group would be and how we would set the Climate Action Office up to be additive and complementary to the work that's happening across state government, and think about the advisory capacity roles and work planning and prioritization that the interagency board would help us do. So we drafted a charter for the that is currently with the secretary, with Julie, to consider and sign in the coming weeks. But over the first few meetings, we deliberated on and discussed the set of objectives that you see on this slide to inform the work of the Interagency Advisory Board. So we're thinking about state policy and direction for state agencies related to climate change. We're trying to foster partnerships across government, thinking about how we frame up gaps in climate action, and think about how the Climate Action Office might fill those gaps with added capacity. We've been thinking about prioritization and articulation of resources across government. This will come to fruition this fall when we put together a cumulative package around climate spending for the fiscal year 25 budget. And we've really trying to think about how we maximize resources, understanding that we have limited capacity in this space and want to really make sure we're doubling down where things are most responsive and needing resources. I think many of you know most of the staff in the Climate Action Office, but I just wanted to put a finer point that this has been a mix of new resources in the Agency of Natural Resources, a redirection of staff and other roles previously, and an assimilation of climate staff that was currently serving in roles in the Department of Environmental Conservation, moving into the Secretary's office. So Marion, which you all know, worked closely with all of you to develop the first climate action plan as the GWSA coordinator, is actually leading our work on resilience and adaptation, especially in the built environment, and thinking about how we work with RPCs and municipalities in this space. Megan O'Toole is our climate change mitigation program manager, previously serving in air quality and climate as the attorney there, as well as the policy manager and most recently for climate mitigation. Brian Woods has transitioned to focus on climate change mitigation and coordinate that work specific to buildings and thermal and electricity, as well as a deep dive into our modeling work. Colin Smythe, who obviously has managed the greenhouse gas inventory for years, has brought that work into the Secretary's office now, leaving air quality and climate, and also will be expanding and really helping us think comprehensively about what measuring and tracking progress looks like and how we do that across more than just mitigation, also thinking about metrics for resilience and adaptation and engagement. And we have two new positions with programmatic areas that I would argue we're doing some of right now, but really see as core to the office and will be expanding in the coming months. A natural and working lands position, as well as a community engagement and communications coordinator, understanding how critical this work is with Vermonters. Shifting from sort of the administrative roles, which I will say, it often feels like the last year has been a lot. You would think it would be a simple feat to stand up an office, but this is really a changing time within the Secretary's Office of A&R, with a lot of new staff and programmatic work coming into the body, into the Secretary's office, and we are all thinking about what that means as an agency and how we do its service with setting up the processes going long-term success. That said, a lot of the work that you all are familiar with has carried forward into the climate office as we adopted the initial climate action plan. And while what I'm highlighting here are many technical analyses that you all are familiar with, what I wanted to try to put a finer point on is not only the contractual work, but how we're thinking about that contractual work pivoting to implementation and actual responsibilities of staff long-term and carrying forward. So the Municipal Vulnerability Index, which was a requirement of the GWSA, is something that we've been advancing through a contract with ERG, who's also helping us, as Julie mentioned, Eastern Resources Group, with our life cycle analysis. That work long-term, while it's the development of a tool through a contract, is something that we see as core to responsibility for us to implement and help support the use of going forward. So we've requested funding in our budget for fiscal year 24. Which budget are we in? I think I messed up on budget. We're still in 23, so I jumped us a year, sorry, earlier. We're fiscal year 24 starts on July 1st. So we actually have requested funding in our budget for fiscal year 24 to support implementation of the Municipal Vulnerability Index. And that relationship that we're standing up and building with RPCs to do that is something we see as a long-term beneficial for us to thinking about how we roll out the MVI, but also how we roll out and coordinate climate action at the municipal level with support from RPCs. That is very much going to be coordinated with the Climate Action Toolkit, which is also a requirement of the GWSA and is helping to assemble a website, but also capacity through Marion and RPCs at actually lifting up tools, case studies, and other coordinated efforts with the Municipal Vulnerability Index of how municipalities can access the work that the data they need to actually inform resource deployment and planning going forward. The buildings and thermal sector study is something that you all as a council supported, and we made time and effort resources to put together a quantitative analysis of policy options for to decarbonize the building and thermal sector in response to looking at, in response to looking at the cost effectiveness of the clean heat standard. This is an analysis that we'll see through this summer and think about how we coordinate and share that information to inform the PUC's process. In addition, though, one of the fundamental aspects of the buildings and thermal sector study was an update to the business as usual model. So that was the model that we developed as a in support of the initial climate action plan to say what the current policies in place get us for emissions reductions to meet our 2025 and 2030 requirements. We've updated that and put a significant amount of work into how we roll that out to inform not only this analysis, but other analyses such as the carbon reduction strategy, which you as a council have signaled to as something that you're waiting on to inform the transportation policy sphere. So we're coordinating that as well. And we'll work closely with VTrans so that they understand how to apply the BAU model. The life cycle analysis, as you know, is a requirement that we've been moving forward with from the GWSA, but we are now based on the passage of S5. One of the limited pointing to of ANR through the Affordable Heat Act was a requirement that we do a life cycle analysis of our energy use annually now. So this initial contract is helping us set up a methodology and procedure for doing that. And it's something that we hope to be able to replicate going forward in-house. And we know that this contract will also support the rulemaking that Secretary Moore alluded to, that Climate Action Office staff will be leading with Rachel Stevens on. The agricultural emissions analysis is one of many components of an update to our greenhouse gas inventory that we've been thinking about, understanding that the greenhouse gas inventory is the backstop to the statutory emissions reductions requirements. And we want to make sure that we understand all the tools and data that exist out there to inform how we track and measure emissions in the inventory to the best way possible. And so we're working closely with the ag agency, specifically looking at those tools in the agricultural sector to ensure that the co-benefits of practices being deployed on the ground, and we understand if we can track the gross emission reductions of those benefits in the inventory, and we'll work closely to implement any recommended changes into the inventory going forward. And finally, the last contract around community engagement, which obviously is with CBI, but also brings in subcontractors that are Vermont-based, also include BIPOC representatives to help us support moving forward, not only broad-based engagement, but also focus groups, frontline and impacted community engagement, as well as the idea of climate coalitions, and also supporting payment for frontline and impacted communities is something that has taken a lot of work for us to get to. We're in a phase now of ensuring that's in alignment with the principles and concepts rolling out from the EJ office, and thinking about how we better coordinate that work with the EJ team, and are well positioned to do that with both of those offices within the Secretary's office, as Phoebes mentioned. One of the components that I wanted to highlight that spoke a lot, that you all spoke a lot to at the March meeting of the Climate Council, and thinking about how you measure and track progress, is something that, as you'll all remember from the first Climate Action Plan, sits squarely with ANR to think about, and we have the resources to deploy, is developing a measuring and tracking progress tool. The first phase of what we envision to be a multi-year process is for us to think about how we compile and visualize the data and what those metrics are specifically related to adaptation and resilience, as well as mitigation strategies for reducing emissions in Vermont. So what are the measurable objectives that we would want to track in a tool, and where do we get the data and tools needed to do that? We have an RFP drafted. We hope to post that in the coming weeks and think about that first phase. We see this as a whole climate action office undertaking, knowing that the metrics needed to, especially for adaptation and resilience, are not there. It was actually signaled in the climate action plan that we would consider and further this space. And so that's something that we see as a long process before we even get to building the tool. And we're also thinking about metrics around community engagement so that we can demonstrate and explain to Vermonters the work that we're doing in order to engage them in what is a long-term effort to address the requirements of the GWSA and climate action broadly. In support of that, we also have been developing a climate action plan tracking tool. That's going to be really relevant to the next item that I'm going to speak to around the Inflation Reduction Act. But before I do, just want to say that for the state hazard mitigation plan, for the CEP, the comprehensive energy plan, the state agencies responsible for those state plans on an annual basis report out where action has been made relevant to recommendations, as well as any notes. Colin, to his credit with Excel, has done a great job of pulling in all of the pathways, strategies, and actions Excel sheets that were developed for the climate action plan. And we as state agencies are reviewing all of the actions that we are, where we are articulated as the lead implementer, and making note of whether or not the actions are completed, being advanced, implemented, or being implemented, advancing, or no action, in a space for us to think about how we further prioritize the actions where we're not making as much progress right now. So it's a first step for us to pull all into one place, all of the CAP actions, and think about how we track progress going forward and how we would further prioritize them, which speaks to the final thing I wanted to mention, and maybe I kind of saved the best for last for all of you, but the largest pot of money that was available, I shouldn't say it's the largest pot, one of the largest pots available to state agencies in the Inflation Reduction Act were climate pollution reduction grants. States this spring had an option to opt in to CPRG grants. And if you did, states were awarded, or will be awarded, I should say, $3 million for state climate action planning. We in Vermont are very well positioned to receive these funds and use it to further prioritize and build upon our current climate action plan, as well as support the further iteration of additional climate action plans farther out. So what you'll see up on top is a flow chart of the timeline associated with the CPRG planning grant. Back in March, we as a state, along with the majority of states, I believe there were only 2 states that didn't opted in to become eligible for these funds. We as a climate office with the Interagency Advisory Board and others within our agency here worked to develop a work plan and a grant application that we submitted in April that outlined how we were going to meet the 2 deliverables that we needed to speak to: the development of a priority climate action plan and the development of a comprehensive climate action plan, and are now currently awaiting funding being awarded to us. And we were originally told that funding would come in on June 1st, and now are being told more like end of July, early August for those $3 million. But despite the money not hitting the coffers yet, we, as a climate action office, have an eye towards the development of the PCAP, which is the Priority Climate Action Plan. The PCAP, unlike the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, which I would argue very much aligns with our climate action plan as a state, is really focused on specific sectors and specific areas that we want to lift up, and we'll make those actions that we lift up tied specifically to the availability of implementation grants, which go live in the first quarter of 2024. So any action lifted up in the PCAP, we can apply as a state for an implementation grant, as well as covered entities by the PCAP. So we envision RPCs and municipalities as covered entities can apply and access $4.6 billion of competitive funds starting in the first quarter of 2024. So I want to sort of speak in a little bit more detail to what we're working on with the PCAP, but I also just want to touch on quickly that we expect to come back to the council in the fall to talk a little bit more about how the CPRG grant will align with the CCAP, because if you've noticed, the CCAP, coincidentally for us as a state, couldn't be better timed. It's due exactly the same time that our update to our climate action plan is due. So we very much expect that the next climate action plan will essentially be our CCAP due in the summer of 2025. So that's sort of the second phase once we've gone through the PCAP. And as a result, we'll be thinking about how we coordinate that with you once we have a better vision come the fall. So just briefly, the CPRG and the budget and the next steps, which we see as a core component of the work of the Climate Office over the next 6 to 9 months in an effort to develop that PCAP. We've built a timeline to actually develop it, not by March of 2024, but we're working really hard to develop it by the end of the year, in hopes that by lifting up a substantive PCAP by the end of the year, we'll have more time to be front of line to access implementation grants at the beginning of 2024, rather than sort of falling in line with other states. So we're going to try a little bit to be overachievers in this space so that we have a better success of thinking about what implementation grants could be driven towards. One thing I've sort of failed to mention, but I will before I go through this, the budget and next steps, is that climate pollution reduction grants are focused specifically on mitigation actions and not tied to actions in the climate action plan around resilience and adaptation. When we focus on mitigation, sequestration also counts in this space, but we are moving through with a prioritization effort that looks at all CAP actions in a hopes of furthering the CCAP process down the road. But know that when it becomes time for us to submit the PCAP, it will only be focused on mitigation actions and not others, because that's all that's eligible in the space for these funds. But we're thinking about how we pick up and run with some of the other resilience and adaptation work, knowing that we have these dedicated resources right now for mitigation. So just briefly on the CPRG budget, high level overview, the commitments we've made to EPA is we've been thinking about investments to support the next iteration of the climate action plan, thinking about a limited service position to help in that space. That position would also really be focused on CPRG implementation action applications in service of other state agencies. We have committed to the Public Service Department funding through the CPRG grant to help manage and grow their thermal program. We've been thinking about temporary staff for the greenhouse gas inventory and all the supplemental analyses we're now committed to doing, namely the life cycle analysis, as well as likely some agricultural analysis going forward. We've prioritized additional funding to support community engagement. We are required through the PCAP to put forward what's called a low income disadvantaged community assessment for expected LIDAC assessment. So a methodology for how we would evaluate benefits received by low income disadvantaged communities by the funding applications we would put forward for implementation grants. So we've been thinking about how to frame that up in community engagement, as well as thinking about additional funding for translation services to do so. We have significant resources for contracted services and technical analyses update. We really see most of those going to the CCAP or the update to the climate action plan, knowing that we'll need technical analyses updates, as well as thinking about a subgrant to RPCs to be our conduit for outreach to municipalities and alignment of energy plans, so that those plans can be incorporated by reference essentially into our PCAP, and RPCs and municipalities can have access to implementation grants as well. And finally, I just really wanted to highlight, since I heard this from many of you at the March meeting, we see the PCAP as this first step in prioritization of state actions in the climate action plan. We see this as work carried out by state government and supported by the Interagency Advisory Board to the Climate Action Office. But we see being able to present this prioritization to the council to inform the next iteration of the climate action plan this fall into next year, in an effort to really track and monitor progress associated with the climate action plan. So that's sort of something I really wanted to hone in on, knowing that was an interest of the council, and it's something that we're currently moving forward with. So the CPRG grant is something we're really excited about, giving sort of framework and methodology for us to think about how we move forward with our mitigation work specifically, but we're excited about the opportunity to coordinate with the Interagency Advisory Board broadly on priorities around the CAP, and we'll look forward to keeping the council apprised of that progress. So that's really the core work that we've been up to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And as you ask questions, I'd look forward to hearing feedback on other areas that you'd be interested in hearing updates on in future iterations of plans. If this is helpful, how else we can frame up these updates to make them most useful to all of you.
Super. Thank you, Jane. Okay. So a significant amount of information there. Whole bunch of new acronyms. We'll have to get comfortable with those as we go. So it's a little tricky because we just dumped a ton of information, but I'm interested from counselors, like, are there things that you'd like a little more clarity on? Jane asked a question as well about, future updates of the work that the Climate Action Office is doing. What would be most helpful? How would people want to react to all this work that Jane just described? I see some in the chat there. Joey, yeah, you want to say what you put in the chat?
I mean, I sort of wrote my comment in the chat, but I'm just deeply appreciative of all the work Jane and others on the team are doing in this space. It's a really big deal, and it's really exciting and important. And what you just laid out with the carbon pollution reduction grant program is really exciting. I don't have an answer yet to your question about process, but I do have one question about the potential scale of the opportunity through the carbon pollution reduction grant program. I know there's something in the order of like 4.3 billion or some massive amount of money to be potentially shared by states, but do we have a sense of what that could look like over what amount of time, and if there's anything that the appointed members of the Climate Council or others might do to support the Climate Action Office and, accessing those opportunities, money? I'd welcome that now or later, but mostly just to say thanks, but I'm curious about the scale too.
Yeah. Thanks, Joey. And so I'll just note, yeah, it is $4.6 billion competitive, and all 48 states who opted into planning grants will have access to that. We haven't gotten guidance yet on how those implementation grants will be awarded. We expect that to come out this summer, and that is something we can talk about when we share the PCAP and where we're headed with that. And I suspect support would be great, so thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Jared?
I just want to echo the thanks for the work and for the update, Jane and team. I have one question that is more of a look ahead question, and I don't think we need to go into it in too much detail today, but I just want to ask, Jane, as you and others in the Climate Action Office have reviewed the requirements or the criteria for the comprehensive climate action plan from EPA. I'm just wondering what you may be noticing in terms of how our existing climate action plan, in terms of its structure and format and the content of it, is your set. I mean, there may be other ways in which we want to update the CAP, in terms of the format of how we produce it to be more accessible. There may be considerations like that, but I'm wondering if, as we look ahead to meeting the EPA requirements for the comprehensive climate action plan, is there anything that you have already noticed about our existing CAP that we may need to change, adapt, add to in order to meet those requirements and criteria that we should have in mind as we begin planning ahead for the next iteration of the climate action plan, so that it can do exactly what you mentioned, which is service the state's climate action plan, but also meet all of the criteria that the EPA has set for it to function as our comprehensive climate action plan as well. That's my broad question.
So thank you for that. And I'll start, and then since Megan's with me too and helping lead on this work, I'll invite her to add on to anything I might miss. But I think our plan, the requirements as they've put forward are really targeted at states that don't have Global Warming Solutions Act and haven't even done greenhouse gas inventories before, pathways modeling, all of the things that we did for the first climate action plan are really spoken to very clearly in the CCAP requirements. What Megan and I have talked about, as well as others in the office, is some of the areas around enabling actions that we touched on in our climate action plan, but didn't go in deep. And these are conversations we at our agency will have about how we want to address them. But things like workforce are lifted up quite a bit in the requirements of EPA. We had to actually write a section about how we were going to speak to workforce, as well as equity and the obviously the application of the LIDAC assessment, expected benefits and results. We've done a great job with our guiding principles and equity impact assessment, but obviously didn't have the time needed the first time around to do it the service that we all really wanted to. So I think those broader enabling components that frame up the whole plan and the actions within are something that EPA is asking us to think about now. But the overall structure and components of the plan are very much in line with the work that we did for the first CAP.
Thanks, Shane.
Sorry.
Yeah, I can distribute the elements of the comprehensive climate action plan that EPA has articulated so far. And as Jane said, they really closely align with all of the requirements of the Vermont climate action plan, which is really helpful for us. There are a few additional items that we will need to add in, like a workforce planning analysis, and then a plan for how we would leverage other federal funding opportunities to implement mitigation, resilience, and adaptation work. I think there's certainly opportunities to expand the scope in positive ways, but there is also a reflection of the type of work that EPA expects from states that have existing plans in place, and how this will help to update or expand upon existing planning efforts. But I can share the link to the EPA guidance in the chat so that folks can see what their expectations are.
Thanks, Megan. Okay.
Yeah.
We got two more hands right now. David, and then Rich.
Throughout your presentation, you kept referring to Vermont opted in. Who opted in? Was it an action of the governor, the legislature, both?
Yeah, it was the secretary opted in on behalf of the Agency of Natural Resources. So ANR is the lead for the climate pollution reduction grants.
Okay, so it was the administration took action to opt in.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Who are the two states that did not? I'm just curious.
Go for it.
I think there were 3 states. It was Florida, one of the Dakotas, and maybe Idaho, I want to say. And I'll also just mention, since we're talking about jurisdictions, that not only will the states be competing for the implementation funding, but around 70 metropolitan areas and then tribal governments as well. So there's a big group that will be looking to access this funding.
Okay, and without getting into the weeds at this point, because I understand that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Will some amount of these funds be available to municipalities and NGOs? Because as far down towards the community I heard in your presentation was the regional planning commissions. And that regional planning commissions are great, not knocking them, but they're not towns and they're not NGOs.
Municipalities are also eligible to access the implementation funding. And as Jane mentioned, our plan will cover the activities that they have ongoing, and then will be updated with the comprehensive plan to include their planning efforts so that they can access the funding.
Okay, and what about NGOs?
No. They are not eligible entities.
Can they be made eligible? I mean, if that's what we write in?
No, unfortunately, as you'll see in the guidance that I'll drop in the chat, the universe of eligible entities is restricted in the federal law. So we can't expand the scope of that.
Little short-sighted on my, so on.
Rich, did you have a question too?
Sorry, Rich, go ahead. I was on mute.
Sure. Thanks. First, thanks for the report. I mean, an amazing amount of work, impressive report. Thank you a lot. Two questions. I understand that there was also a special provision in the federal climate legislation for grants to rural electric co-ops. And I wondered whether you were aware, or if anyone else on the call was aware, of whether our rural co-ops are planning to apply for funding that would be authorized under, it looks like June will have an answer for that in a minute. My second question, Jane, goes to the PCAP. And a couple of times you said that you intend to present the PCAP to the council probably in the fall. And I guess my question is, will that be fully baked at that time? Or do you expect that you would be coming to us with your thinking and asking for our input before it's fully baked?
Yeah. Well, so the PCAP will be drafted in large support by the Interagency Advisory Board and the Climate Action Office. It's focused explicitly, or we've taken the approach in our work plan with the EPA to focus it explicitly on state-led actions. So the drivers around how we lift up priority climate actions. There is components, they have to have measurable greenhouse gas emission benefits, but there's also the reality of administrative capacity as well as broad support within state agencies to lift up the ones that are most appropriate right now. So we've been focusing it in on state agencies leading the PCAP process, and we will put it out for review and consider thinking about how the Climate Council weighs in for comments on that in the fall, along with public comment.
And June, did you want to comment on the rural electric co-op issue?
Yeah, Rich, the answer is yes and yes.
Yes, they both intend to apply.
They're
Great.
aware, and they in fact have. And they are doing some of that work independently because the law authorizes that.
Yeah.
And there's also a project that they've joined in, which the department has sponsored, that relates to creating a statewide storage type facility, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
Ability for statewide storage.
Okay. Great. Any other questions or comments related to Jane's presentation and the work of the Climate Action Office? Anything else? So I think the question she offered, that Jane offered at the end about what types of information would be most helpful, if that's not totally clear in your minds right now, she would welcome, and you can do it directly to her or through me or whoever, to send that in to say, in future meetings, it'd be really helpful to know what you're doing in this space or what's going on over here. So please don't feel shy about putting some requests in about information you'd like to know that's what's going on. Joey?
Thanks for the invitation, David and Jane, on that front. I guess one other just question, and maybe you don't know this yet, but 48 or 47 states, Florida, okay, didn't choose to take advantage of this opportunity. But is there any effort by DOE to sort of coordinate and at all? Like I'm thinking about, in the transportation work, I think there's a recognition that a regional approach should be most helpful. Are there efforts afoot, or do you see any opportunity through this process to learn more from other states and peers in this work?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Joey. First, let me just say that when the handful of states that didn't opt in, those planning grants go down to the next largest municipalities that didn't make it to the original cut of municipalities who got planning grants. So just so you all know that money sort of got repurposed to the next largest cities to take advantage of climate pollution reduction grants. And as for regional coordination, that's a question that EPA put into the work plan and grant that we had to develop. There was questions about where we saw the need for, they have a term for it, innovation, but they were EPA innovation groups. Innovation teams. And asked us specifically what were areas where we saw the need for innovation teams in our region. And then we've been having close conversations. And in fact, just last week, have had a conversation ongoing with the CPRG grants leads in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And in all honesty, they're just taking it upon ourselves to meet and have a day-long meeting where we present each other with our processes and process and talk about it. And we'll likely reach out to EPA and think about how we formalize some of the needs in that space and what the gaps are. But yes, that was a part of the application that we booked.
Thanks, Joey. Okay. All right. So anything else, folks, on this? Yes. All right, so why don't we do this? Our next thing on the agenda is to do public comment. So let's do that. And certainly it's public comment on anything that we've been working on today. So I would encourage folks who've been with us today, if there's pieces of the conversation you want to make sure you counselors hear, this is a great time to do that. So let's take a pause for that. And Annette, I see your hand is up, so go right ahead, please.
Yes, I'm going to go back to the biomass group. From the steering committee meeting, I was under the impression that there would be representatives of each subcommittee and that it was going to be only counselors. So I'm not seeing the whole realm of the subcommittees represented, or could you please see if this is how you're planning to do it. So my understanding is Jared was going to represent the steering committee, and Julie Moore was representing science and data, and Bram was representing cross-sector mitigation. And if David Dean is joining rural resilience, then he would be rural resilience. And Kelly is just transitions. So who is ag and ecosystems?
Great. Is there anything else you want to say before someone might answer that question, Annette?
Okay, I like conversations rather than just having to do this. Well, so if you look at the subcommittees, the representation of counselors, I'll put it in the chat, is just so overwhelmingly on cross-sector mitigation. And you really only have 2 potential counselors from ag and ecosystems, Abby Corse, who's obviously very, very busy with her farming, and Lauren. So I would like to make sure that ag and ecosystems gets represented. I mean, this is all about trees and forests, and many, many, many people participated and were a part of that biomass task group, putting many hours into it. And now this whole sort of dialing into people who weren't part of it, and some of whom have clearly got specific agendas. It's just, it's concerning, and I'd like to make sure that nature and the environment is represented. So my other comment or question is, are these going to be private meetings or public meetings? And if they are going to be private meetings, would it be possible to take minutes and post the minutes so that at least those of us who have an interest in this are aware of the discussions and can follow along and see where it's going? The lack of transparency that appears to be about to take place here is concerning, and also the idea that this could drag on for many months when this topic has already dragged on for many, many, many months. I just like to, from the public interest perspective, make sure that there is some sort of a window into it for the public, and that nature and the environment have a voice. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. So before going to Pike, I'll pause on those specific points suggested by Annette and put forward by Annette, excuse me. And I'd welcome folks who have been part of the this initial group to reflect on this. I can say a little bit about the representation on from the different subcommittees, because indeed, ag and ecosystem, at one point, Abby, of course, was going to be part of this group, and she unfortunately is too busy to be part of it. And so there's an effort now to figure out what to do about that. And there isn't a clear answer to that yet. But I will say, and that certainly from those of us who are trying to help support this group, that's front and center to how to solve that problem and to have ag and ecosystem representation as part of this group. I would invite members of the folks who are doing this. Bram, if you want to say a little bit about also the private public question about the group as well. Bram?
Yeah. All right. Sorry, dogs. So a few things relative to making sure that the forests and ecological systems spokesperson and a defender at the table. I know for myself, and probably for other people on this group, that I think about the health of our forests and the entire global ecosystem all the time. And well, it's why we're here. Whether we solve the formal seat designated to ag and ecosystems or not, the Lorax will be in the room. And relative to how we run the process publicly versus privately, if we make these public meetings, it will slow the process down. And you pointed out the concern about having it drag on because you have to notice meetings and all of those things, and we may have opportunities to meet on short notice that we will want to take. So our thought was that these would be private meetings, and that the opportunity, the public portion of the process, will happen at the subcommittee level. Or at the whole council level, when the biomass group returns to the whole council with a revised recommendation, that will be the time for public input into that process. And as for your questions as to whether we can take and post minutes, I don't know the answer to that, so I will leave that piece to someone who knows.
Right. Sure. Certainly, you hear the suggestion. Let's take that on. I don't see an impediment to that at all. Yeah. David and then Kelly.
I was at that meeting and there was no set membership that was set out. I believe we had discussed and sort of ticked off names associated with committees, but did not say, here are the committees that have to be represented or they should be represented. It's just the way it fell out. There is no plan afoot to keep the environment out of the discussion. And quite honestly, Annette, I'm somewhat taken aback by you thinking that it wouldn't be part of the discussion if I was there. This is a writing group, wasn't intended, and that was a specific discussion that we had. And we're not going to try and rewrite policy. We're going to try and organize what's there, make what was put together available to a curious public, and get it in front of the full council for discussion and decision as soon as possible. So this is not a formal decision process. And I think the way the committee handled it came out, I was comfortable with it, and there will be plenty of time for review.
Yeah, thanks, David. Kelly? And I just want to say there was a group that the steering committee spoke about that Secretary Clouser, in which they asked Secretary Clouser to approve, and that group was the sort of core group of counselors, and there's flexibility around who's actually there. Kelly?
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to also provide a little bit of background. We've met, this smaller group met one time for about half an hour. So we haven't had a lot of time to decide how we want to move forward. And so questions of how we can make the process transparent, but also be agile and be able to get something back in front of the council and the subcommittees and the public sooner rather than later. So we're trying to balance those two things. And I really appreciate your questions about that, Annette. And I think that we briefly mentioned, maybe after some people already had to leave at the end of our meeting, different ways that we might be able to make the process more transparent while maintaining that agility to be able to say, hey, anyone available for a quick meeting? We want to just, run some things by you, so that we can have that ability to do some things faster than we could otherwise if we had to publicly warn every single meeting in advance. So definitely good questions to raise, and something that we will be continuing to discuss as we move through this process, because we're already thinking about that. And also, yes, the LoreHex will be there. If I could be on ag and ecosystems in addition to everything else I'm doing, I would love that, because I have a big concern about our the ecosystems and resiliency and how we're using our land and how we're treating all of the plants and animals well that we are interacting with on a daily basis and that live in Vermont, not just the people. So thank you.
Thanks. I want to make sure there's opportunity for other people who have comments as well, public comments. So Jared, if you could, a quick reaction here, and then I want to turn it back and see if anybody else in the public wants to comment.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I just want to offer a correction. I'm not on this working group. I believe that the steering committee we wanted to make sure that there were members of the steering committee so that that could be reported back, and this conversation and work could continue apace, but with Bram and Kelly and Julie involved. So I just for the record, I'm not part of this smaller working group. I will say that my primary expectation and hope from this working group is a lot of people, I think 8 to 10, maybe more counselors, provided feedback on the draft recommendations, questions, concerns, suggested revisions, many of which were provided in track changes. And so I think ideally what this group is doing, and thank you for stepping forward to provide this service, is to identify where we do have consensus and agreement on certain recommendations versus other ones where we do not, to bring forward a consensus group of recommendations, or as near to consensus that we can get, of recommendations for consideration by the council. And in terms of the process and who has eyes on it, the proof will be in the pudding of, you know, what we actually vote on and what gets shared and able to be reviewed and discussed at a future council meeting. But I see this as primarily a process to basically wade through, you know, those many comments and proposed revisions and figure out where we have agreement to move forward, and where those recommendations many councilors thought were not ready or appropriate to move forward.
Okay. Thanks, Jared. Okay, great. Pike, you've had your hand up. I always encourage folks, if they want to, use their camera as they're talking, just it helps. But Pike, you're up. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to invite everyone to a symposium tomorrow evening in Burlington City Hall, Contoy's Auditorium. It's a symposium on the one side with Bill Muma and Juliet Rooney Vargas, two climate scientists, and on the other side, Darren Springer and other representatives of Burlington Electric and the McNeil biomass plant. And the topic is biomass and forest resiliency and carbon emissions and carbon accounting. And I encourage you all either to come in person or to watch on television. I think it'll be informative. Second of all, I'd like to make a request. It sounds like several members, Mr. Duvall most recently said that there are written letters from council members and other documents regarding the biomass recommendations. And I would ask that Ms. Larazchak make those public so that we can see those. I want to thank Secretary Moore for sharing my letter, but also I want to recognize that we had another series of email exchanges regarding the Agency of Natural Resources continued statements that IPCC guidelines state that biomass would be considered carbon neutral. And Secretary Moore in an email acknowledged that IPCC guidelines do not in fact say so. However, locally, the damage has already been done. The pathways analysis, the MAC cost curve analysis, and other documents, the inventory itself, the emissions inventory itself, are already considering biomass as carbon neutral. Policy recommendations, PUC decisions are being made on this information. So I think it's incumbent upon ANR and the Climate Council to go back to these documents that you commissioned, such as the pathways analysis, and have them redone so that there is not this embedded assumption that biomass is carbon neutral. Because if you go to tomorrow's symposium, I think you'll hear once again that it is not. I'd also like to point out a couple of other bills. They haven't passed yet, and maybe that's why Secretary Moore didn't include them in her list, but S24 and S59 both relate to biomass and or biofuels with embedded assumptions in both of those. So I'd like to put those in front of your eyes because they will be discussed coming up. And thank you for your time.
Okay. Thank you, Pike. Okay, great. Other folks who've been joining us today who have a comment or want to say something now before we finish up the public comment section? Okay. Great. So before we finish up, any final reflections from counselors on today's meeting or things that you've heard, whether in public comment or elsewhere in the meeting? Anything else that we think it's important to reflect on before we finish up today? Anything that these conversations have prompted? Okay. Great. So today was a day that was heavy on presenting information, and thanks for everyone for hanging in there, listening to a lot of important information. The next council meeting is estimated to be in September. And unless I'm mistaken, Jane, I don't think we actually have a date for it yet. You're on mute if you want to be chiming in on that. Yeah.
I guess not, no. The
Yeah.
steering committee is meeting actually again in June, because we had a short meeting last to prepare for today's meeting, but the steering committee will meet again and we'll set the council meeting.
Right. So expect it probably a Monday in September. We'll be gathered again. And we look forward to seeing you there. As always, you're all welcome to come to those steering committee meetings and listen in to what's going on and the coordination that's trying to happen there. So we'd welcome counselors to come be part of it. Anything else on anybody else's side? Secretary Clauser, anybody before we finish up here today? All good? Okay. Anything else, Jane, on your end? Okay, super. All right. Thank you, everyone. That was hard to do without a break on Zoom. I don't know about you all, but I'm going to go get some lunch. Take care, everybody. And we'll be seeing you in subsequent meetings. Have a good week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody.
Bye-bye.